Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. It's 8 o'clock, if you don't mind. Welcome, everybody. I'm Ed Powers, Program Director for Aerospace Medicine Residency Program at UTMB. Welcome to our grand rounds. And today we have a good speaker I'll introduce in just a moment. But first of all, got a couple little things. We have two new faculty members who have joined us, Dr. Cheryl Lowry and Dr. Brian Pinkston. And hopefully have an opportunity after this to say hello to them, but you'll see more of them in the future as well. I want to let you know that we have upcoming grand rounds speakers. After today, we have in October, we have Dr. White, who's going to be talking to us about travel and tropical medicine. That'll be October the 9th. And November the 13th, we have Dr. Jeff Ferroni, who will give us an ethics presentation. And then December the 11th, we've got Doug Ebert, who's going to give us a rundown of the comfort study that they've been doing. And 2019 schedule hasn't been solidified yet. We've got a lot of good speakers. So, of course, any suggestions, I've gotten many from you, and I appreciate them. And any future suggestions are welcome as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Dr. Sharon Petronella is from UTMB, and she's a professor with tenure in the Department of Preventive Medicine and Community Health, which is where our residency resides. And she is director of the Community-Based Research and Community Engagement at Seeley Center for Environmental Health and Medicine, and director of Community Engagement Institute for Translational Sciences. She comes to us originally from, are you originally from Galveston? Are you from? Okay, great. So a native of Galveston. She has a BA in English from University of Houston, Clear Lake, an MS in the Health Education and Promotion, University of Texas Medical Branch at Galveston, and a PhD in Epidemiology at UTMB in Galveston. And so with that, I'm going to let you go ahead and begin. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be here this morning. I think the topic is appropriate in the current weather, and that we have a system moving into the Gulf that could impact us by the end of the week, and also to think about Florence and all the preparations that are going on the East Coast right now. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background and about what's been kind of a long, strange trip for our center to get to where we are. So first of all, I don't have any disclosures to make, financial or otherwise. I'm going to talk a little bit about UTMB's ongoing role as an anchor hospital for disaster preparedness and response. Not everyone knows that we are actually the anchor hospital for 5-state region, which is Talon, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. And that's for, which is why when we had the Ebola case in Dallas, that we actually received all of the waste from Dallas to dispose of. I'm going to talk a little bit about the NIH vision for disaster research response and why they think that research should be a part of disaster preparedness and response. One way of looking at how we could do this better than what we currently do is a whole community approach to preparedness and resiliency. And then what are the opportunities for science to become embedded in that response, such that not only does it not get in the way, but it improves our ability to respond to a disaster, and it improves our knowledge to prepare for the next. So here's the beginning of our long, strange trip. So these are just numbers, and they're actually a little dated. I think this was before Superstorm Sandy actually hit. And these are a number of events and then also dollars. So if a disaster, particularly a weather disaster, is going to impact the United States, many times it's going to be affect the Gulf of Mexico. And then there are a lot of things that are non-weather related that are nonetheless important. So how many of y'all actually know how we define, I sit on a committee, the National Academies of Science, for large-scale disasters and national preparation for large-scale disasters. And it was surprising to me that when I joined the committee, I didn't actually know what the definition of a disaster was. Can everybody venture a guess? Okay, by your silence, I guess no. It's any event, no matter how large or how small, that overwhelms a community's capacity to deal with it. So what would be just a blip on the radar in a large area that's well prepared to deal with something may actually be a catastrophe for a smaller community that lacks the resources to deal with something. So and I didn't realize that. So when you think about disaster in that context, you can look at these things and realize it wouldn't take long for many communities to become overwhelmed, whether it's an infectious disease or the wildfires that we had in Bastrop, the fires that we've had ongoing for the past couple of years on the West Coast. Many communities have just been overwhelmed. So our trip started in Katrina. Our center has been funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences since 1997. And in 2005, we got a call from the director of NIEHS in North Carolina and said, we need you to do something. You're the only center that we have, the only P30 center we have on the Gulf Coast. Get over and do something. And we were like, well, what does that mean? When the magnitude of the disaster in Katrina and Rita came ashore 3 weeks later and impacted much of the same area. So you have a catastrophe on top of a catastrophe, and people who had left New Orleans and evacuated to Texas were now run out of wherever they were taking shelter because Rita came ashore. So what we did was the simplest thing that we could think of. We started a series of needs assessments and relief and response. We did the things that people do when there are storms. We collected lists of things that people needed. People needed diapers, and they needed water, and they needed bug spray, and they needed building materials. So all the things that we, after Ike, needed, or any storm, all the things that you need. What we did that was a little different, and this was really why I've emphasized the during disasters, is that it's about understanding what's happening when it's happening and then being able to process it later. And if you don't collect data while it's happening, it's difficult to make sense of what did. Our memories are affected by, and we have differential recall. And so we started on a year-long assessment, and back then, nobody was using a term like community resiliency. Resiliency has kind of become jargon or a buzzword, but what we really did was collect stories about were some communities not overwhelmed by the disaster, and why were other communities just completely not able to come back. So we collected those stories, we collected some data, and then we went on a roadshow basically throughout South Louisiana to help communities learn from each other. And a prime example of that is the Principal Chief Dardar with the United Homa Nation said, we can't wait around for FEMA to show up. We can't wait around for the missionaries to show up. We have to be prepared. And so one of the things that they did in the aftermath of Katrina was that they bought or leased warehouses. And when supplies are low, they stock them. They buy plywood, they buy insulation, they buy everything, diapers and water, all those things that you might need. So there is no waiting. You don't have to wait for somebody to come in and rescue you. You're prepared. The other thing that he's done that's amazing to me is that they have MOUs signed with tribes all across the Gulf Coast. It's not a question when they're ready to evacuate. Every family knows where they're going and where they're going to be staying, and they check in when they get there. So they have this really, to me, simple but fairly sophisticated system of preparedness. And that's something we can learn from, and it's something that we can model. So that's just an example of where we started back in 2005 to realize we really can improve how well we are prepared, thinking from a community perspective as opposed to an individual perspective. And then came Ike. So for those of you, how many of y'all were here for Ike? Okay, quite a few of you. These are painful pictures. These were our story, and what I'd like you to look at here is this is where the water went. So you can see we had a lot of flooding and from Ike. And a lot of devastation. One of the things that you do see here, in addition to all the debris that you see on the roads, what you'll also see is that sediment sludge that was deposited in all of the houses on the island. The island sustained flooding of 75% of our structures. We had up to 11 feet of water in some areas of town, including on the UTMB campus. And this is what was inside all those buildings, is this sediment sludge. It came from the bay, and So this was for us very up close and personal. We were expected to provide relief and response, and I think that it's never a good idea for someone who's actually living the disaster to be the one who's responsible for providing guidance. I don't think any of us were in that right frame of mind, which again is something that we can learn how to do better. I'll talk about in a minute. So again, we had this need for this community-based participatory research. And that's a term that really describes an approach to research. And because what happened is St. Vincent's House, which many of you know, that's where we operate multiple clinics that are run by our faculty and our students. But it's also a social service agency. They called us and said, well, there's all this sludge here. It's all in all the projects. It's everywhere. What's in it? And we were like, well, I don't know because I'm busy mucking out my own house, but we'll find out. Okay, we'll call TCEQ and we'll find out. But what TCEQ had done is what TCEQ, it's their standard procedure. They took 4-foot core samples. They took core samples outside to see what was, seeped into the ground. When in reality, that wasn't the research question. The research question that needed to be answered was what was inside these houses where people were going in confined spaces. It's drying out. It's becoming, it's becoming dust, and people are ingesting it. They're inhaling it. And we still didn't know what was in there. So community-based participatory research, it was a problem that originated with the community that science needed to answer in order for us to protect the public health. So that's what we did, is we gathered some money, about $17,000. And based upon what we found, we really needed to do this risk communication because we had thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, workers that were coming from all over the country, and also all these college students and people who were coming with church groups to help people clean up their houses. And we needed to educate them on how to protect themselves. So why were we worried about the sludge? I'm going to go through these very quickly. These are all taken in Galveston. And you can see that even under our sink, this is not my sink, but it could have been, that there are many things that ended up in that sludge, that ended up in the water. And including in Galveston, most of you know we have a brand new $50 million waste treatment plant at 51st Street. But before we had that, we had an old treatment plant that wasn't particularly prepared to deal with the storm. So in other words, when you're looking at that sludge, it smelled because it was actually municipal waste. There's no other way to say it that's nice. So it was sulfur, it was chemicals, it was oil, it was anything and everything that was on the railroad tracks when the floods came. And then the waters receded and it was all left in our houses. So the water came from the bay. A lot of people think that we were breached from the seawall. We weren't. The seawall was not breached. The water was lapping over the top, but we were not breached. That's not where the floods came from. The storm was so big that it actually came around and it swept the water up from the bay, up onto the island, and then it receded quickly once the storm had passed. So this sediment was covered everything. We weren't sure what was in it, but we were fairly certain that it was an accumulation of toxics and toxicants. We already had fish consumption advisories because there are persistent chemicals in the bay that are legacy pollutants. We had a creosote plant. There was, everybody knows about the San Jacinto waste pits. We have our own waste pits in Texas City, the McGinnis pits, and that are only covered by a layer of clay. And so we were pretty certain that much of that was in our houses. And we worked in conjunction. I'm really proud of the city of Galveston because we worked with the city manager, told them what we were planning to do. And he said, absolutely, we have to know what's here because we can't make public health decisions about what we're going to do until we actually know what that is. So these are where we sampled. We didn't sample because this was, any type of random sampling. We did purposive sampling. We picked the places that we thought would be the absolute worst based upon modeling that showed where the sediment was located. Because we figured if it wasn't terrible there, then it wouldn't be terrible elsewhere. Because we had a relatively small amount of money. And this is what it looked like. By now, it's dried up, it's cracked, but it's also, like I said, the dust is starting to blow around. And these were the things that we looked for. So semi-volatile organics, we looked for asbestos, sulfur compounds, heavy metals, organic chemicals, diesel range organics. We looked for all of these things. And this is one of our community partners that went through training with us to help collect the samples. And we did that for a specific reason about risk communication, is that particularly when you're in a disaster situation and people are afraid, their hearing goes bad. They can't hear what we're saying, especially if you don't have a relationship of trust with them. It's difficult for them to access what you're saying, if they don't know you. So what we did was we involved the community in the research itself to where they could talk about what it is that we were doing and be our voices of reason and be our information source for communities that otherwise we would look like we were just descending from the ivory tower to come out and do good and tell them, well, you're okay. And they really didn't know if they believed that. These are what we found. And we were very, very fortunate. What you see in red are where we exceed. There's two levels of screening. The first level is the EPA residential screening level, which is, as you can see down here at the bottom, is very low. And that's the level at which we would expect to have no health effects or no ill health effects from exposure. That higher level, which is on the very bottom row, is the level at which we have to take action, when we have to do something to deal with what we found. And what we found wasn't pretty, but we also we exceeded the residential screening level, but we did not meet the level where it had to be remediated officially. And that's a good thing, because as you can see, we found levels of arsenic, especially in areas that were of concern. And the only way to get rid of that, such that it satisfies our own rules, is to bind it to cement or concrete and dispose of it in a hazardous landfill. It would have required that any place that we found these levels, we would have had to have removed a foot of topsoil. Now, if you think about the logistics of 75% of the island being flooded and having to remove a foot of topsoil, Galveston would not look like Galveston looks today if we'd had to do that. They would have had to make some very tough decisions about what we were going to do and how we were going to deal with it, because financially, that was just crazy to even think about. But we had to know. So this is what we did find, and this all came from an idea that was spawned by the community and said, we have to know, and we need science to tell us, because we just don't have the resources or the ability to identify risk for ourselves. So I thought this was a great example of government and science and the community itself working together to identify the magnitude of a problem. So these are some of the things that we did to act on that. We got lots of donations of PPE and cleaning materials and kits, and we trained people how to do it safely. And that if you had a family member who was immunocompromised, leave them off the island until you were ready for them to come back, and that you were sure that it was safe for them, or even kids. We didn't want kids rolling around out in the dirt or on playgrounds until it had been remediated. Galveston and all of our parks and all of our schools, they did go ahead and remove much of the topsoil and replaced it with clean topsoil just to make sure, because we already had a historic problem with lead from historic buildings. So we worked with the city manager's office, the county health district, and then public affairs to broadcast what the issues were. So this approach that we used, it just really in many ways is common sense. Are we done? Oh, wait, okay. Is that it's not a method. It's just that the way that we do it, it starts with a topic that's important to the community. These are the principles, is that what we want to do is bring every resource that we can to the table. And sometimes those resources are not necessarily our colleagues. It's our community members. So for instance, in some of the research I've been involved in, where I wanted to look at seafood sampling across the Gulf, the experts there were the commercial fishermen. So they weren't people necessarily with PhDs. It was the people who were doing that work every day. So embracing this approach It's highly relevant. You increase your likelihood of recruitment and retention, but you have to realize that we can't even agree necessarily what is the definition of a community. It could be a geographic group. It could be a group that's bound together by certain ideals. But sometimes people have competing ideas about what a solution should look like. Not that we have that in any of our politics in the United States, but it's okay to have disagreements as long as we can figure out where it is that we have these gaps and then work together. So then came the Deepwater Horizon, and all those communities that we had worked with in Louisiana started calling us. The United Home and Nation was the first on the phone and said, we are being impacted by this. It's terrible. They've closed the Gulf, and we can't do anything. We can't fish. A lot of us, work offshore. We don't know what's happening, but everybody's lying to us because the news was reporting many different sources of information that this is how much was flowing. This is when they thought it was going to be capped. The White House had one projection, NOAA had another, and Halliburton and BP were saying something entirely different. So they called because they trusted us and said, will you just come talk to us? And so we just gathered up some scientists from UTMB, and then we brought in Trevor Penning from University of Pennsylvania because they're specialists in PAHs. And so we came and we talked to that group, and they said, well, could you come over and talk to the Vietnamese community in Biloxi? So we ended up talking to 24 different community groups just to answer their questions. And they were pretty sophisticated questions that were coming. When is it going to stop? What are going to be the short-term effects? What are going to be the long-term effects? How do we interpret seafood guidelines? That was a big one because they were doing all these preliminary testing, FDA and EPA, and it was all in parts per million and parts per billion. And, and they were like, well, what does that even mean? How many parts per million of white shrimp we can eat to raise our cancer risk in 30 years? What does that mean right now? And so we said, well, we don't know, but we're going to help you find out. And that's what we set out to do. I put in these because this is response. This is what the response was to this. We're booming, they're burning. It was get out there and prevent that oil from getting to the shoreline because we had so much at risk. It wasn't just the fisheries. Now you're talking about tourism. And now you're talking about, basically our whole economy. When you think about all the estuaries getting fouled, shrimping could have been done for. These were what the shrimpers were very worried about. And so everybody was busy doing things. Nothing was coordinated. Everybody descended from all over the country for, the alphabet soup of federal response, but there wasn't a consolidated plan. And at one point I was at a meeting and there was a lot of frustration, and these are people that were actually the responders. And one woman stood up and she says, have you looked at the federal, at how we work together? Have you looked at our org chart? Because there's not a lot of horizontal lines. And that's where a whole community approach to disaster comes in, is that sometimes we have to have horizontal lines. We have to coordinate our responses. And that was a directive that came out in 2011. So to get back to what was going on at the community level, from the community perspective, this is not only, it's their way of life, especially when you consider that, that the Home Nation has been occupying, Southeast Louisiana, 17 parishes in Southeast Louisiana for years. And it's not just for them about the economy, but they also depend on offshore drilling as well. We think about people that are these commercial fishermen, or they're working offshore. Well, a lot of times it's the same guys. They're working, they're offshore, they come back on shore for 3 weeks, and they're off 2 or 3 weeks, and they're fishing in the meantime. There was a lot of fear and anger, a lot of distrust, just grief. People went to a lot of effort to express how upset they were at what was happening, and feeling like, a lot of times it's not what happens to you, it's whether or not you have any say-so in what happens to you. And there was a lot of helplessness. And this is just a picture. This is actually before the oil spill. This is just what coastal erosion looks like in Louisiana. And so a lot of frustration. So if you look at what was happening and think about back to that, what we talked about the approach to doing research, it's not a trick. It's how do you engage people when they're that angry? And one of my friends who works with a lot of environmental justice communities said, until people put down their rocks, they're not going to be able to talk to you. And, you know, when they're still that angry, they just can't have a conversation with you about what they're worried about or how they can contribute to an effort. So that's what we did, is by going over there and having these conversations. This is what we found. We listened, and this is not what we came up with, because that's how typically science does it. We come up with a great idea and we descend on the community and we explain to them why, you know, we're their best hope, you know, coming in to help. And instead, we did listen to them, and they were worried about those long-term health effects and the shorter-term health effects of eating the seafood. We wrote the grant together. We wrote this grant for NIEHS. Our fishermen wrote the sampling schema. We couldn't have done it without them. I did not know when we started this. I was born in Galveston. I've been eating seafood all my life out of the Gulf. And many times we've caught the seafood that we eat out of the Gulf. I didn't know that shrimp travel an average of 200 miles in their lifetime. That, you know, they are born in the estuaries, they go out to the continental shelf, they make their way back. Had no idea how they actually locate them. And in some cases, these are things that they pass down from generation to generation. So this is just what we did. We had we identified the problem and the issue that we wanted to work on. We had community organizations from 4 states across the Gulf. I was the director of our cohort study. We enrolled 500 people in 3 different research locations, and in Galveston was our comparison community, because we didn't get into the oil here. And we did a clinical cohort study that lasted for 4 years. We took blood and urine and hair and samples, and then we were also sampling from their catch at the same time. These were fishing communities. The communities that we worked with were from these areas where the oil had made landfall. And it's not a coincidence that that's one of the same maps, very similar map that I showed you earlier, that is typically affected when we have a storm in the Gulf. They have lots of water intrusion. So you think about, one of the things they were worried about is, there's going to be a lot of stuff that sinks to the bottom. And when we have a major storm, are these mats going to start washing back up into the estuaries to where we have to worry about recontamination of really vulnerable areas? So we had, let me see if I've got, these are our partners. So it was UTMB, the University of Pennsylvania, Texas A&M at Galveston, LSU in Baton Rouge and Lafayette. We worked with 6 different community groups, and that each one brought something different to the table. The Center for Environmental and Economic Justice is in Biloxi. It's primarily minority, very low income, but they do a lot of subsistence fishing. They recommended that we work with the Vietnamese fishing community in Gulfport, which is across the street from Biloxi if you've ever been there. But their seafood consumption is quite different. They actually consume the whole fish. They eat the organs. The eyes are considered a specialty. So they were worried that maybe they were at increased, and we were worried that maybe they were at increased risk because of their consumption patterns. We worked with United Home Nation, the Alabama Fisheries Cooperative, and BISCO in Southeast Louisiana, which covers a huge amount of southern Louisiana, which is considered the sacrifice zone. And what that means is that when the levee systems do go into place, those are the areas of South Louisiana that will not be protected. So they're very worried about what's happening now and then what's going to happen to them in the future. So we were looking at health impacts and community resiliency, and it was really important that our community partners play a major role in this, and they did. So I'm going to go quickly through this. This is us on the road. I have a mobile clinic that we would take out into the communities, because especially in Louisiana, you could be 2 miles as the crow flies, but if the roads are washed out, it can be a really long drive to get to a clinic. So we have a mobile clinic that we use, and we'd go out and see people, and we still use that. We're actually moving it to Dickinson this week for a study that we're doing for Harvey. So this was another thing that happened. How many of y'all were here when we had the bunker oil spill? Remember? Okay, there was actually a barge and a ship collided, and it was carrying bunker fuel, which is, it's not even legal to burn it close to shore anymore. You have to be 200 miles offshore to burn this stuff because it's so gross. It's like that thick dregs at the end of the process. And so we had this bunker oil spill in Galveston Bay. And unfortunately, we were having a weather event and the winds were really high. And in the blink of an eye, it swept it through the bay, down around, and it went all the way down basically to the Mexican border, and depositing all this thick black gunk in the meantime. Well, what you see out here, and the picture's probably too small, but that's a shrimp boat. There's a shrimp boat, and then there's those little boats that are out there booming the oil. So we never stopped harvesting seafood while that was going on. There was no policy, there was no integration or coordination of efforts. It was like, well, we don't even know what to do. We're just going to keep on doing what we do. And as you can see, we bought this at a local shop and right in Galveston, and that's blue crab that's visibly oil. So we think that we should be, and the whole point of this is that we really should be preparing from before something happens, not when something happens and we're scrambling trying to figure out what it is that we're supposed to do. There was the beach replenishment. We had people contact us that were very concerned because it was like everybody was excited about getting these new beaches, but they were pumping it from the Houston Ship Channel. And we were like, well, I actually called the Corps of Engineers and I said, can we have a copy of your report where you're testing this as it's being pumped up? And they're like, no. And I was like, no, really, just to look at. And they were like, no. So we went out and we collected our own samples, and everything was fine. Everything was fine. But in the meantime, when you're not transparent and you don't share information with people, they don't believe you. So when people are saying it's fine, but you don't need to see the data, well, maybe they did need to see the data, and because it could have been a huge public health problem if it hadn't been, but it was. So in all of these things, since 2005, what are the lessons that we learned? That a response is necessary, but it's frequently inefficient to accurately identify what are the real risks to human health. That we could do a lot better job if we just could figure out how we can work together. And that we should be building partnerships between and among existing groups. We shouldn't be creating new groups necessarily. And the last thing that especially the first responders want is for us to be in the way when they're trying to deal with a real situation where people could be at risk. And but we can't do any of those things if we don't establish the infrastructure and policies before something happens. And a perfect example was when that bunker oil spill was going on, we got a call from the Coast Guard and said, everybody that went into the water has these rashes. What is it? And we were like, well, I don't know. Did you capture any samples? No. Oh. Well, if we had some samples, we could have probably told you what they were exposed to. In the meantime, treat it like it's, contact dermatitis because don't know. And yet it would have been so easy for them to capture their own samples if they were concerned, and they were concerned about going into the water. But we didn't have that policy or that procedure in place. So what's this whole community? So there was this presidential policy directive on national preparedness. And it's kind of hilarious, but not really, because everybody came up with their own. So the president said, in 2011, well, I want everybody to work together, and you guys get out there and you coordinate efforts. So everybody wrote their own plan on how they would do that. And I think one of the better ones is FEMA's, actually, this whole community approach to emergency management. And the whole basis of that is that we want to bring everybody to the table. Everybody should be talking. It should be communities. It should be those first responders. It should be industry, the nonprofit sector. We should have a joint plan to how we can be the most coordinated and integrated as we are dealing with things. Because most of the time, it's not if something's going to happen, at least here on the Gulf Coast, it's when it's going to happen. I mean, we have a system right in the Gulf right now, and it's not like, or will be at the end of the weekend. It's not like we don't know that that's going to happen. We do know it's going to happen, and we can be better. So, but we have to have conversations to figure out how we do that together. So this is just literally came from something that Francis Collins wrote, and that we constantly are dealing with this, and we learn, we think we learn, and then we repeat the same mistakes again and again, and until we figure out how that's the definition of insanity, is doing things the same old way, and then you never change anything, but you expect something different to happen. So this is what NIH came up with. They said, we're going to make this commitment to disaster resilience. What's that going to look like? We don't know, but we have to do a better job of what we're doing. And so these are some of the things that they suggested, that clinical standards, protocols, and data sets. We should be thinking about what we need before we need it. When we sent out all the vessels of opportunity for the Deepwater Horizon, a lot of the fishermen were so grateful to be able to get back on the water and earn some money. A lot of them ended up with respiratory problems and other health problems that they attribute to the exposures that they sustained when they were burning oil or in those areas. But we didn't take any samples. We didn't have any lung function testing. We didn't have blood. We didn't have urine. We have no idea what their baseline was. So until we start thinking about that, and at the time, they lacked institutional review board approval to do that. So NIEHS was training these workers and sending them out there knowing that they really needed those baselines, but there was nothing they could do about it. They could not get approval to do the work and then to follow them up over time. So the time to be thinking about that is now, and the time to get those policies and procedures in place and approved is before something happens, because we can't wait. It can take 6 months. It took me 1.5 years to get into the field with GC Harms because of the threat of litigation. And they told us, if somebody subpoenas us for your information, I'm talking about the names of your subjects, you're going to have to give it to them. And I was like, no, I have protection because I have a certificate of confidentiality. And, this is me arguing with the lawyer from NIH. And he says, it's never been tested in court. And if you show that you have people with high levels of PAHs in their blood, then BP can come to you and say, I want to know who that is and I want to know where they live, because I want to talk to them. And I was like, well, I'm not going to do that. So it took us a long time to figure out how to protect people. But the time to be thinking about that is not when something's happened and you're trying to get into the field, it's beforehand. So these are the recommendations. So develop these mutual partnerships. Start small, figure out how we can work together. We're actually talking to the Beach Patrol, because Beach Patrol is search and rescue for Galveston. And they have, I don't know if you've seen their big monster truck that can go through 8 feet of water. But Peter has already said, we'll collect your samples for you. When we go out and we bring people in, we'll collect samples automatically, because we can rig the vehicle to do that. So really about thinking about doing this before something happens, and making sure that whatever we find, that it's disseminated in such a way that people can use it. If we collect data, that's really frustrating, to collect data and do science that isn't actually helpful to people, or that they can't use it. To leverage emergency management training. Really to one of the important things for me is understanding how we can learn from people who are doing it. Just like we learned from the HOMA, industry has a lot of good protocols. When we did a tabletop exercise with industry in Houston, and the guy from, I think it was from Chevron, I said, well, what are you doing? There's that 20-foot wall of water. What are you doing right now? And he says, I'm evacuating my family. And I said, well, what about, who's minding the plant? And he says, there's already a whole team there from all over the country, because somebody who's going through a personal crisis shouldn't have the reins when something like this has happened. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And it found out after the fact that, that there's a lot of companies that have that policy. HEB is one of them. I don't know, for any of y'all who were here after Ike, they were the first grocery store to open, and it was entirely by people who came from San Antonio, California, from all over, to help get them through that, and to let their families get out and do what they needed to do to take care. So we can learn from one another what it means to be resilient. And for us, it was all about getting those protocols in place. So NIH finally came up with this rapid overview, and it's to get all those IRB policies approved and to have standardized methodologies. So you don't have all these different groups dropping in, doing, to do research. You're all working together, and we all say, we're not going to do 40 surveys, we're going to do one survey, and then we're going to share the data, which makes perfect sense because people get fatigued by being surveyed to death. So this is what we've been working on in Galveston. I already have IRB approval for all of my disaster protocols. It's, if I want to do lung function testing, that's not rocket science. You do the same way every time. It's by the American Thoracic Society. That can be read and approved in advance. Phlebotomy, how we take blood, how we take urine, all those things can be pre-approved. So what I have in place now with our IRB is that when something happens, I submit to them basically a one-page document that says, Harvey happened, we have flooding right now, I need to go in, I'm going to use these instruments and I'm going to use these protocols for blood collection, blah, 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 and I need you, I'm going to enroll 100 people, I need you to approve this. And I can be in the field in 2 days instead of a year and a half. So these are all things that we've been working on, and then I think this is the last thing I'm going to close with is this little, we wanted to, when you talk to people about this imaginary future disaster, everybody's interested and everybody wants to work together, but at the same time, it's imaginary. It's really hard to wrap your mind about how we might work together. So we thought we would do something with hydrofluoric acid. And so why hydrofluoric acid? Well, we have a lot of it. It's used in the gasoline process, and we have over 1 million pounds just at one facility in Texas City at any one time. We have a lot more in Deer Park, and so there's lots of it, and it's really nasty. It's a killer. If you get it on your skin, basically what it does is it stops your heart. It interferes with calcium channels. It produces a vapor cloud that's heavier than air. So depending upon what the weather situation is, you can have a very different threat to the public health. There's only one recommended treatment for it. It's calcium gluconate. And unfortunately, it's on a shortage. We have a shortage of calcium gluconate. And it's not in the chem pack that for disaster response. So we thought, well, maybe we could put on this symposium and we could talk about, well, how could science contribute to efforts to actually prepare for this hypothetical event, but that could be real. So this was back in 2016. And so we came up with this tabletop scenario, and we said, okay, it's going to be based on a real event that we had. We had this real event with a problem with hydrofluoric acid. And so if the worst case scenario would be that the plume actually was 25 miles long, 640,000 people could be sickened or actually killed if that were the case. And then we had Lawrence Livermore National Lab and the Weather Service take existing modeling programs and say, okay, take the same data and you tell me what you're going to give to our incident command to evacuate people or tell them to shelter in place. You show us how we would do it. Because this is what would happen if there were a real incident. We would be making decisions based upon these models. Well, unfortunately, while we're dealing with this and they're working on the models, we actually had a release in Texas City. And it was a significant release. Everybody who was in the vicinity was hospitalized. We had 16 patients treated that came. And what do you think is the number at which, so remember we talked about the definition of disaster. What's the number at which UTMB, the anchor hospital for the 5-state region, remember, what's the magic number that we're overwhelmed in the emergency room with cases like this? 15. We had 16. The only thing that saved us is that the plant was really, really well prepared. They had plenty of calcium gluconate, and they did decon in the field. It wasn't perfect, but they did decon in the field, and because the protocol is that you arrive wet and naked and being treated with calcium gluconate. They have to just basically pack it on, and so they had sent people that were already being treated, so that enabled us to respond. This is what it looks like. This is what disaster preparation looks like, is everybody, just waiting for the first cases to show up. And in this case, what happened was everybody came and it's hydrofluoric acid. So the people who show up, it's the burns team, right? Wrong, because we didn't have anybody with burns. We had everybody with pulmonary injuries. And so what actually came out of this is we had our little symposium. We had a lot of interest. We thought we were going to have 30 people in a room talking about this hypothetical incident, and we had 100 people from all over the state of Texas and then some. Actually, Honeywell sent a medical doctor to talk about, wow, this could have been really bad, and it wasn't because we kind of got lucky. You know, it didn't get out of the facility. The water curtain worked. They weren't sure, you know, whether the water curtain was going to work. If it had failed, we could have been talking about multiple injuries, but we didn't. But it was time to have a talk about that. And so we talked about, well, what would we do different? How could we prepare better? And again, this whole concept of the whole community response, because the people that showed up were the people that were involved. It was the ambulance drivers. It was the first responders. It was, SETRAC, which is the Southeast Texas Regional Advisory Council, Department of Homeland Security, because in most cases, this is an accident that occurs in a commercial facility. But what if somebody did something on purpose? That would be a pretty significant threat. So these are all the things that we talked about, and everybody, you know, they all had ideas about what they wanted to talk about and what were our roles were and what would a national response look like. And this is one of the things that came out of it. So this is one model, and you can see this is exactly what happened. If the water curtain had failed, what would have happened? This is what it could have looked like. These are very different models that would show a much narrower area, but much more severe. But when you start, what happened back in 1987 when we had an incident, they told everybody to shelter in place. Right up until they got worried, you know, this is going on too long. Maybe we should evacuate. And they evacuated people through the vapor cloud. So we got to do better than that. So this was kind of to drive home that we need better data if we want to make good decisions. So what in this particular incident, and even whether it's a weather event or whatever the nature of the disaster, what are the things that the scientific community can do to actually inform disaster preparedness? So the mapping and modeling, but also risk assessments. UTMB is working on, Mike Mastrangelo, who's our institutional preparedness officer, has gotten a grant to work with the port on chemical safety and to look at what are multiple chemical risks, and do we have a good public health response program in place to deal with that particular incident. The toxicological assessments, engaging communities in citizen science endeavors. You know, we hear that now, see something, say something. And, that's really important, but we also have to empower people. If you see something, measure something, get a picture, take a sample, do something, but they have to be trained to do that. And we have lots of opportunities. We have lots of people here that are concerned about the environment and involved in working with the environment that can be our allies here, particularly when there's not $1 zillion to go around for environmental sampling. And this again, you know, that this whole notion that we should be working together and really to start with the Gulf Coast and to figure out how we deal with our own problems here. How many of y'all have ever been stuck on the Atchafalaya Bridge? Because I have multiple times, and it's a 19-mile bridge that that there's no way to get off. There's no way to to get on. You're not going anywhere if it's shut down. Well, where do you think our hydrofluoric acid is coming from? Just the other side of Baton Rouge. And it comes 3 times a week, and it comes straight down I-10, and then it takes a deviation onto 146, which I took 146 on the way here. And it's primarily by 18-wheeler. We have a major accident on the Atchafalaya Bridge. We have no idea what would happen. We have no idea what would happen. And if they would actually what would happen to the ecology, what would happen to the swamps. They had an incident in Korea, and they actually put down 12,000 cattle that were exposed. So, this could be a real disaster. This, nobody can read that, and that's okay. It's just that this is something that we came up with when we were at the symposium, that if we had to deal with an incident like that, who would be involved at what stage? And I put that up there just to show you that this happened in 20 minutes of the people at the table saying, I could see myself plugged in here. I could think that we could do this here. So there are ways to do it, but we really need to put that in place. So that's all I got. Did I make the time? Good. Does anybody have any questions? Please.
Thank you, Dr. Croissant. That was excellent. We have a few minutes for some questions. I'd first like to open it up to our remote locations, our remote sites. Is there anybody off-site who would like to ask a question of Dr. Croissant? Okay, if there's no questions from off-site, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to the room. I have a microphone here so that the folks off-site can hear the question as well. So, do you have any questions in the room?
Thank you, Sharon, for a great talk. When these particularly weather disasters happen, there are groups from all over the country that mobilize themselves and want to come and help. And how and at what level do they get educated about what their risks are, how to behave, what to bring? Is there any coordination that tries to integrate the church groups and the community groups and other groups that just show up?
That's a great question, because the simple answer is right now there's not a lot of coordination. There's an organization called VOAD, which is Volunteers Organized Against Disasters, but we don't even have an operational chapter. And when you consider what happened last year with Hurricane Harvey, and as grateful as we all were that the Cajun Navy showed up and the Texas Navy showed up, and that everybody came, but if they're organizing themselves, we need to work with them to be prepared, because they did a lot of dangerous things. The Galveston, I think people don't realize this, that the Galveston County Health District offers free training, and it's disaster response training, and it's not for first responders, it's for normal people, and it's how do you do first aid in the field? And it's basic first aid, but how do you stop bleeding? How do you, what do you do? And it's things like, how do you leverage floodwaters to move things to really get people out of trapped areas? So there's training that can be done, and they'll do it absolutely free of cost. And Mark Sloan, who's head of emergency management for Harris County, has said, yeah, we'll sponsor it. You want the Astrodome, whatever you want to do, we'll sponsor it. But, so there's opportunities for that training to go on and to do, to learn CPR and all the different things. But we don't have, nobody's really in charge of that at this point. But I think there's a lot that needs to be done, because we still don't know who responded and what they were exposed to. That's one of the things that we're looking at with our Harvey study is, so I didn't really, I do realize this from Hurricane Ike, and I like to think that things have improved since then, but there are no standards for remediation of housing stock that has been flooded and treated for mold. There are no standards. Anybody can come in and say, I'm a contractor and I know what I'm doing and I can fix this for you. And there's no standards or guidelines for how they should do it. And there's no recourse for people who say you did it wrong. We have problems with mold, persistent problems with mold. So that's one of the things that we're doing, is we're going to be doing air quality testing in houses that have been remediated, looking at the ways that they've been remediated. And because if FEMA is going to go to this thing now where they don't make you right, they just make you okay, where they'll muck out your, to pay for you to muck out your house, but not necessarily to make it livable, then they should at least have the bare bones that people have to adhere to do that. So great question.
In discussing the Gulf oil spill, you showed a slide listing all of the groups that you worked with and coordinated with. It was kind of impressive, but I didn't see any industry groups on that list. In that response, did you work with any industry groups?
Not directly for that, because we were just looking at seafood consumption. But we do work with a lot of, and we're really interested in expanding our industry partners because, like I mentioned with the example from Chevron, in many ways they do disaster response and better than we do it. So, but not in that particular instance. There was, we worked with the community groups and just doing the cohort and then the seafood sampling. So and as far as dissemination and involving people in discussions, everyone was involved. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I think when you're talking about needs assessments and coordinating that effort, one of the things that a lot of the articles about Hurricane Sandy talked about was the community actually using social networking and stuff like that to say, hey, we need this. Does anyone have anything like that? Can you talk a little bit about social networking and other new technologies that can help you in your disaster management?
And I think the opportunity for citizen science, and especially using social, not just social networking, but social media, is really important because that's what happened with Hurricane Harvey. A friend of mine who's actually in industry, he worked for Anadarko, his daughter came to him and said, they're in Conroe now, but she said, Dad, I'm getting reports from all over, from my friends that are taking pictures, Instagram and everything, and of the flooding. And so they said, well, you know what? We can put this out there. We can start building these, helping contribute to reports about flooding. And then they ended up being a referral site for search and rescue. And because they just put this number and said, if you can reach us, get through to us and we will dispatch it. And but it was all so random. They would put it out there, oh, somebody needs help here. And, and hopefully somebody would respond. But there was not this coordinated effort to be recording. And obviously, the first responders were just overwhelmed. I mean, everybody was overwhelmed. And so really, even though that was a rain event, think about how catastrophic it was for our communities, because we got it doesn't take much for our fragile drainage system to become overwhelmed. I hope I don't find that out firsthand on the way home. Yes, I'm sorry.
Thanks again. During and after Harvey, those of us who were in the South Shore area, we were held up at a local church with about 700 people from the community, and had a lot of really ill people who couldn't get that dialysis centers, et cetera, et cetera. And we were really stuck until the DMAT showed up in Dickinson about 2.5, 3 days after the event. I didn't hear you mention the interaction you have with the DMATs. They were a godsend, because when they finally got boots on the ground, we were able to load these critical patients in a school bus and get them off to the DMAT. But without that, I mean, these people would have died. So what's your interaction? What's the reliance? And what's the role to increase the awareness of the DMAT and the capability of the DMAT with your plans in the community?
We don't have that plan in place right now, but I think that's a perfect example of a relationship that should be explored. And Mike Mastrangelo, that I work with real closely, as far as the institutional preparedness for UTMB, that would probably be something that would be coordinated with SETRAC, because do y'all know what SETRAC is? The Southeast Texas Regional Advisory Council, but they're also the ones who are responsible for healthcare coordination for in the event of a disaster. And so when we get overwhelmed, then what their job is to say, okay, we're deploying resources from here to here. So they're going to step back and be kind of the puppet master and and deploy those resources. But it's really hard to do, especially from a distance. We're a huge geographic area, and just as a perfect example, we have buses that I think are in Tyler, Jasper. Anyway, they're in East Texas, but we have ambulance buses, that are capable of taking a lot of people. But at minimum, in perfect weather, it's going to take us 3 hours to get them, and that's not fast enough. And it doesn't account for the fact that roads aren't open. So I think that's a perfect example of what needs to be done. The other thing that happened in Galveston County, we lost people. People died because they couldn't get to dialysis. And there are examples that have come out of Hurricane Maria and Irma that impacted Puerto Rico, where, very low tech, they were able to do some things that were, to me, astounding. And that was that they said, this is coming and we can't avoid it, you know, and we're going to get hit. And so who can take what? And they were worried about patients that had been discharged from the hospital that were dependent on oxygen, that were dependent on other electric equipment. And so they were scrambling, but they did the best they could to identify who's going to have power, who's going to have a generator, and to get hold of patients before the storm actually hit and say, make your way here. They will have power for, you know, for your equipment. A lot of people still died. Obviously, you know, thousands of people still died. But we should be thinking about those things ourselves. And we weren't prepared when Harvey came. We didn't have mobile vehicles to get out and do dialysis, and we didn't know who was going to be able to function or who could step in and serve as staff. If your staff can't get there, can you recruit, you know, another staff that can go in and at least use the equipment? Absolutely. Yes.
Well, thank you, Dr. Croissant. We're at the top of the hour now, so we'll go ahead and bring it to a close. And I want to give a special thanks to our Administrative Secretary, Kayla Vanderweide, who set up all of our CME sign-in sheets and coffee and everything and helped organize this today, as usual. So excellent job. Thanks. And thanks. Very timely. The worst hurricanes that have hit the Galveston-Houston corridor have been about this time of year, early September. So, yeah. So we appreciate it. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing all of you in the next session.